Let's see. Oh, we're on already. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for being here. What a great group that we have this morning. Before we get started, it's always helpful for just us to get a sense of who is here. And we love having a very diverse audience of students, faculty, staff, people from outside. I would like to, if you please don't mind identifying yourself, who came from off campus for today's event? Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for being here. Who is a faculty or staff member at FIU? And then who is a graduate student and undergraduate student? This is can you get a more evenly balanced, interesting group of folks? That's certainly what we hope for when we put on something like this. And the purpose of today is really engage in a discussion to think and talk about the field of leadership research, broadly speaking, and engage with some discussion. 30, 40 years ago, if we said, all right, we want to talk about leadership research, there was leadership research going on, but there wasn't nearly as much of it. And when I started in the field as a PhD student, I was given the advice, don't go into leadership, it's not a real field, by several professors. And this was in 1998, so I'm dating myself a little bit, but that was 25 years ago. Now you look at all the major journals in management, not just in business schools, but across, and a huge portion of the articles that you see are on leadership, because there's this recognition that we need to understand this phenomenon. This is not to celebrate leadership, but this is to consider the various ways that leadership manifests itself, how we can develop and grow leadership, and really try and wrestle with what that looks like. It's certainly not a celebration of all things leaders, or does not deny the fact that leadership involves many people. It can be shared. It can be bottom up. It's really important to look at those angles as well. So we are here today for the Leadership Research Colloquium, which we have been running since 2011. So this is now the 13th iteration of this. We did run this also a little bit during the pandemic. It's a 12th iteration because one year we missed. My name is Nathan Hiller, and I'm Executive Director at the Center for Leadership. I'm also a professor in the College of Business. We are proud today to welcome two awardees of our leadership of our Alva Chapman Global Leadership Dissertation Award. And this award has been given out now for almost as many years as we've been running these research colloquia. And it's really to get the best and brightest, to flag the best and brightest new scholars who are studying leadership. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Lee, who's at Queen's University, who is an assistant professor in strategy and organization. I had to get the title of right, because the department titles are always a little bit weird. At Queen's University, which is just outside of Toronto, for those of you who are geographically inclined. And I'll introduce her first, and then I'll do a quick introduction as well of Cindy Maupin. But Michelle is a recipient of the Alva Chapman. If any of you know Miami, Alva Chapman may sound like a familiar name to you. Dissertation Award. So without further ado, I'm going to call up Michelle. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing about how your research as it relates to social class background has implications for executives as well as leadership more broadly. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction and also inviting me here. It's nice to get away from Canada, where it's cold, and to come down south, warm. So today I'm really excited to introduce a dissertation topic. And for those of you who are not academics, for our dissertations, we put our heart and soul, we spend so much time on this research. And essentially today, the question that I am asking is, who became CEO? So in 1984, Reader's Digest was considering two individuals for the CEO position. And on many fronts, they were quite similar. So on the left is Kenneth Gilmore. On the right was George Gruen. They had both grown up within Reader's Digest. They were high-level executives that had shown that they're very competent, high-performance people, but they differed on one primary front, and it was actually in how they grew up. So Kenneth Gilmore actually grew up in a wealthier family. His dad was a director and had a master's degree at a time when this was not common. Whereas George Gruen actually grew up in more of hardship. So his dad was a mechanic, his parents separated, and it was through doing track and football that he got a full ride scholarship to Duke University before entering Reader's Digest. So just based on this information, who do you think became CEO? You can just shout out who you think, Kenneth or George? Yeah, so you don't know, right? But so George Gruen was selected, and we'll look at maybe why some of you may have chosen one or the other. Maybe it's the organizations you're in and what they're emphasizing. So I will be discussing social class background throughout this presentation. So I did want to quickly define it. It's the relative socioeconomic rank in society, reflecting the socioeconomic status an individual is born into. It's conceptualized by parental income, education, and occupation. So it's essentially how you grew up and not your current social class. And when we think of social class in the United States, this is a map of upward mobility in the US. And what it shows is the chances of you moving up to the top fifth, starting from the bottom fifth. And you can actually see the lighter areas are areas where there are more instances of mobility. And it's mostly located in the Midwest, but regions in the South, actually, you see there lower percentages of mobility. So the United States, I think social class has become a topic that's become a lot more relevant. People realize that there are classes. And for example, if you're born in the bottom fifth, most likely 70% chance you're likely to stay in the bottom like 2 quintiles of income. And it's the same if you're born in the top quintile, you're more likely to stay there. So that means that social class is very relevant today. And we also saw social class differences emerge with COVID-19. So this is a map of New York City. That's where I'm from. So these are the cases of COVID in New York City. And the darker areas actually represent areas with higher COVID case counts when it first emerged. And if you look at a map of median income in New York City, the lighter areas actually represent areas of lower income. And you can see these darker areas correspond to these lighter areas of lower income. So we saw these class differences emerge with COVID cases. And today we're looking at this idea of how a social class background influences chief executive succession. And the reason that I do so is because CEOs sit at the top of organizations. They control a lot of resources. And not only do they influence their firms, a lot of research recently has shown that they also influence societal level outcomes. And the prior research here suggests that executives of upper class origin tend to be overrepresented among top executives, including among CEOs. But we really haven't seen that much research since a study by Mike Useem and Jeremy Carabell in 1986. It was based on 1970s data. So we don't actually know the social class backgrounds of our executives. And it's important to know how social class might be inferred in interactions because to understand how it affects chief executive successions. So there's a lot of research in social psychology which shows that social class background can be intuitively inferred and automatically picked up through conversations. So boards of directors, when they're interacting with CEO contenders, they can pick it up through informal exchanges, whether it's cocktails or dinners or interviews, and through looking at something like a resume, through cues like the hobbies and interests of the individual, their affiliations, whether they got a scholarship, parents' occupation, are all cues. And in fact, my own interviews with boards of directors kind of basically affirm this. They mentioned that they were able to pick up on the social class background of executives through interactions, through side conversations. Sometimes you go on like a yacht after work and you're able to have personal conversations. Social class, the prior research does show that social class will manifest and affect who becomes CEO above and beyond the effect of education credentials. And the literature on CEO selection seems to suggest that there's a lot of biases and implicit preferences that come into play in selecting a CEO or any executive for that matter. So social psychological theories under the rubric of implicit leadership theory suggest that leadership selection is actually driven by evaluators' perceptions of the degree to which a person matches the prototype of leadership. So evaluators make an automatic categorization of whether an individual fits the leadership prototype or not. And the literature seems to suggest that upper class background may be part of the leadership prototype in corporate America. And this is because for directors, when they're looking at contenders, they're looking at people who can interact with shareholders, engage with them. And before they meet the contender, they don't know the performance outcomes. They may look at clues in the contender's background to see who might actually correspond with these shareholders and have cultural concordance with them. So my research question stems from this assumption that there is an upper class preference for CEOs, and asks how has this preference for upper class candidates changed over time with the rise of shareholder primacy in corporate America? And what organizational factors actually amplify or suppress this effect of social class on CEO selection? So in corporate America, since the 1970s, there's been a big change. So corporations used to be entities with multiple objectives, multiple stakeholders that they considered, including employees and societal outcomes. But in essence, since the 1970s, there's been a principle that's taken over corporate America, and it's called shareholder primacy, where corporations started to really prioritize shareholder value, and shareholders during this time became much more powerful and cohesive. This was a rise of institutional investors. So if you think of hedge funds, private equity funds, wealthy investors, they came on the rise during this time. And because of this, there was an altering of the leadership prototype such that those of upper class were much more likely to be considered concordant with these affluent investors. So with shareholder primacy, companies that are aligned with it are more likely to express their alignment in their corporate communications, whether it's press releases or annual reports. And these companies that state their commitment to shareholder primacy are more likely to rely on this prototype of leadership that advantage upper class candidates. So in the first hypothesis here, we propose that this express conformity to shareholder primacy will amplify the positive effect of upper class contenders' selection chances. In addition, it's not just through express conformity, but also during this time, companies that were aligned with shareholder primacy were more likely to engage in certain actions. So it defined the types of actions that companies were more likely to take. So if, for example, during this time, more companies were likely to divest. So the adoption of divestitures became very common because it amplified shareholder value. There are also companies that started to lay off employees, so this became a very common practice. And a lot of companies actually reduced healthcare benefits for their employees as well as their retirees. So companies that have previously adopted these type of practices are much more likely to enact and select candidates of upper class background. So here we also propose that when companies have previously adopted these practices that are consonant with shareholder primacy, that the effect of an upper class background will be amplified on CEO selection. In addition, as I mentioned, some companies had more affluent ownership during this time, and it changes the makeup of companies. In fact, a lot of research has shown that a few equity investors who are able to amass representation in companies with equity are able to make changes, for example, in compensation schemes, as well as in corporate governance. So in these companies, when these affluent owners own more of these companies, they become much more salient to executives, the boards of directors. So in these companies, here we propose that companies defined by this concentrated ownership by affluent shareholders are much more likely to have an amplified effect of this upper social class background on CEO selection. So we've been talking about things that amplify this upper class background, but there were actually some companies that were resistant to this upper class advantage that ran counter to the tenets of shareholder primacy. And the previous research seems to show that companies that had collective bargaining agreements with labor unions, these companies are more likely to consider other stakeholders besides their shareholders. It raises workers' voices to management. And here, what we propose is that companies with these collective bargaining agreements were more likely to be able to resist the influence of shareholder primacy. So in effect, the upper class effect would be suppressed for CEO selection in these cases. So in summary, this paper looks at this idea of shareholder primacy, what is actually increasing the effect of it, and what might actually decrease the effect of it. So to study this, I collected information on 456 CEO contenders of the S&P 1500 from 1970 to 2013. Most of the data is actually from the 1980s and 1990s, and it's because I had to collect census information, which limited the timeline. So I selected on contenders who were born in 1945 or earlier, where I could find their census records from 1940, which is the most recent census available. And to actually find the parents' information, I had to use a lot of sources like biographies, birth certificates, marriage certificates, to actually trace to their parents and collect this information. So this is an example of a sample census record during this time. So I don't know if you can see. So this lists like the occupation. This is the income. So this 5,000 is actually a very high number during this time. And then here, I think education is somewhere here. So high school, 4th year. So this is how I collected the information. And this is a sample birth record, which lists the parents of the individual. And I did just want to show you a snapshot in comparison to the population at that time. So this is from my larger data set of S&P 1500 CEOs, about 1,000 of them. And what you can see is that a lot of them did come from relatively upper class backgrounds, but you do see some variation. So for example, a 9th grade education during this time put you in the 75th percentile of the population. A 7th grade education put you in the 50th percentile. So overall education income levels were lower in the population, and that's why the percentiles seem high. And just to, I did analyses called conditional logistic regressions to look at this, but I did want to emphasize that my variables here, so social class background, a lot of sociologists and economists have typically used one of these measures, parents' occupation, education, or income, because it's been hard to get all three measures. So I was able to create a measure that incorporated everything, and it really taps into kind of the social cultural and economic resources that you had at childhood. And then in terms of just shareholders' ownership, I did want to mention that this is the ownership by hedge funds, private equity funds, as well as wealthy individuals. So I looked at their total shares over the total equity of the company. And we did try to control and account for explanations other than social class background. So these are things that we controlled for, such as your social ties, number of words that you served here. So hypothesis 1A, so here we proposed that the stronger an organization's expressed conformity to shareholder primacy, the more positive will be the effect of a contender's upper class background on their selection. And you actually do see support here. So if you look at so if you look here, you can actually see that in companies with high espoused shareholder primacy, they're much more likely to select an upper class candidate than in companies with lower espoused shareholder primacy. So these are annual reports where they talk about how much they emphasize shareholder value. And the second hypothesis on organizational practices was also supported. So companies where you see that they had practices that were highly consonant with shareholder primacy that engaged in downsizing, layoffs, and such, were more likely to select on upper class contenders. And also we noticed that with companies where they're owned by more affluent owners, so private equity funds, hedge funds, were also more likely to select on these upper class contenders. So this was also supported. And then finally, we also saw that collective bargaining agreements with labor unions were able to counteract the upper class effect. So when companies had collective bargaining agreements, you actually see that it seems like lower class contenders were more likely to be selected. So there was a consideration of other stakeholders in the decision making. So these are kind of the overall results, which were all supported as we hypothesized. So in terms of implications of this, there's been a lot of studies which have shown that inequality has increased over time. In fact, less and less children are making more than their parents than they used to. And this might explain part of it because this is a very conservative test of CEO contenders who are very capable and where you actually would not pick up so much on their class background, and you actually see that it has an effect. So you can imagine at lower levels of organizations, you might see this effect where upper class candidates are preferred, which may be contributing to the inequality that we see over time. So what this study essentially shows is that over time, this prioritization of one stakeholder, shareholders, has amplified this class preference. In fact, it's amplified an upper class preference. And firms tend to select their CEOs based on the degree to which their contender's background seems to align with their stakeholders. And it also seems like social class may actually be some kind of mediator or a reflection of shareholders or stakeholders' characteristics and preferences. So if firms are selecting on the social class background, and it's causing some firm strategies to reflect these stakeholders' characteristics and preferences. Thank you all. I look forward to any questions later.
Stay up for a minute. So we're going to depart from the exact program because we're going to have Cindy do up next. But let's have a few minutes of a discussion. I know there's probably some questions from the audience related to this. My head is spinning. I'm like, what about this? What about that? Is this just horrible news? So let's take the example of FIU, right? So we have a really high number of students with Pell Grants. Right, we're I think the highest in the country. So like, what does this mean for them? And I know this. I'm asking you to sort of opine of, is this just like a defeatist kind of, where do we go from here?
Yeah, so I don't think it's just bad news. I know I did emphasize all the amplification of upper class, but I did want to mention that recently we've seen a lot of social movements, a lot of changes where stakeholders are now emphasized. I think people have an expectation that companies have to think about society, that they shouldn't be hurting the environment, they should be thinking about the community. So because of that, it might actually mean that there's a slow and gradual change to a preference for lower class candidates.
So there may be, if we were to sort of take this out 10 or 15 years, maybe there's some counteracting forces that may be sort of swinging the pendulum in the other way a little bit, at least?
Yes.
Okay.
I would expect so.
That's good. Any other quick questions? Do you either come up or just yell it? Go ahead.
Yes.
So when I was thinking of, when you initially started the study, I was thinking that maybe the director's own background, the directors are all upper class,
Yeah.
that would influence this selection to a greater extent. Like, did you find anything around that, or is there a reason why it's not part of the model?
Oh yeah, so we did look at that, and we actually found that directors' backgrounds didn't influence the selection. So we collected information on all the boards' social class backgrounds. Took like half a year, but we're able to account for it, and even accounting for it, we see these results.
So would a fair way to say that be they're not just choosing people like them in a simple kind of way?
That's right. So it's
Right.
not just
Okay.
because they're upper class, they're choosing upper class candidates.
So I guess to extend that, so they're choosing upper class candidates because they think they'll fit better with like these upper class shareholders, like
Yes.
funds and Vanguard representative and whatnot.
Yes. So, and I did want to emphasize that it's not that directors have this explicit preference for upper class contenders. It's more like they think about, given two candidates who are very qualified and capable, who might be better able to align with these shareholders. Yes.
So the time period you study also includes like a vast increase in CEO salaries, and just like the proportion of CEO salary being much higher than compared to the average worker. Did you look at that as an outcome variable, or is that something you could study? Just looking at like comfort with having such extreme income inequality within the organization.
Yeah, so that's not a variable that I studied here, but there is actually a lot of research that has shown that this rise of shareholder value has corresponded with a huge increase in CEO compensation. So I do think there is a direct relationship.
CEOs have been getting paid a lot, and they've been getting paid even more over the last several decades, right? So they've always been paid a lot. Now
Yeah.
they're being paid a huge amount, right?
So there is like a counter argument that, hey, if like shareholder value is really important, why does class matter? But you look at outcomes like CEO pay, right? And where CEO pay has increased manyfold and inequality has increased there. So it tells us that this prioritization of shareholders hasn't actually reduced biases, it's increased it.
We have time for one more question, not from the front, from someone in the in the middle or the back. Comments?
Yes?
Wondering if there's kind of a way to kind of calm your weight, because like you said, there's been cues of social class, but not everyone that has been like a lower class has had the same experience, has had or hasn't had similar experiences as someone in a higher class, for instance, travel and extracurricular activities.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that also affects just the way that you consult yourself?
Yes. So there has been like research on this idea of like moving up and kind of the different experiences. So a lot of people who come from lower social class background and mobilize discuss feeling out of place, like in these settings where it's kind of more of an upper class culture. And then sometimes some people, like partners of consulting firms, have mentioned that they went through like polishing to kind of overcome that. So that's definitely an issue that has been researched, that's been found for lower social class people. They struggle to fit in.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We may have some time to return to sort of a joint discussion, but without further ado, I'd like to invite our second award winner that we have with us today. Dr. Cynthia Maupin is assistant professor at the University of Mississippi, and her work intersects sort of teamwork and leadership processes, looking at it in a variety of ways. And not just from a sort of conceptual, empirical, theoretical standpoint, but what this means for the actual practice of team building better teams and leadership. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Dr. Maupin and Dr. Lee, for your really interesting presentations. They will be around. We're going to have a brief reception outside in a few minutes, but before we do that, we want to officially present them with their trophies. So we're going to take a few pictures. So you're welcome to stay after we wrap this up here in about 1 minute and to the reception, and they'll be around for a little bit, for about 30 minutes afterwards. But thank you for being here today. We love this mishmash of folks coming with different perspectives and ideas. It's certainly a challenge to our presenters to present across a wide variety of audience, because like the researchers are like, what about this control? And other people are like, I could care less about that. So thank you both for doing a fantastic job, and for your insights, for sharing them with us today. So I have, let me do Cindy's first here. She is up here already, but Cindy is the 2021, since we're post-COVID, as you mentioned, recipient of the Alva Chapman Dissertation Award. So congratulations, Cindy. And we're going to do yes, exactly. And Dr. Lee. Thank you all for being here.